Hello. Hello, welcome everybody. We are waiting to connect our camera because we want a live feed. But we thank you so much for coming, and yeah, it's late. Last session in the day. It's really appreciated when you see people, yeah, come and attend. This really means that it's yeah, you value the event. So we really thank you. So let's wait a minute until the live feed goes on, and then we will start.
Please go ahead, just to switch it on. Yeah, I will. Okay. Good.
Okay. Okay, great. We are live now, so we can start. Once again, I would like to welcome all of you to this event. My name is Barbara Nakangu. I like to say I'm Ugandan, working with WWF in the Netherlands. I coordinate a program called Voices for Just Climate Action. For this event also, I would like to mention that I'm also an IPCC author of the last assessment that was published also this year, the values assessment. Yeah, so I think yeah, it rhymes well with the theme of the day. So today we are going to be talking about the WWF report that we launched yesterday. The report is called Climate Secrets Early: The Story of Nature in the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. That report we wanted to show, to really try and really bring out and highlight the nature aspects in the detailed IPCC 6th Assessment Report. In this report, it is really what is in the IPCC report. But in addition, we included case studies from the breadth of the WWF work to really add impact and understanding of the report. This report is simple, written for diverse audiences to make it more approachable, accessible to a diverse actors. But actually this report is complementary to the other reports of the IPCC assessment. Recognize there's a 6th assessment that will be released, I think, next year. But also there's a summary report that is complete, that is also accessible. This one is really focusing on the nature aspects, and even this one is only 35 pages. We can't put everything in there, but we've tried to include key messages, simple language, so that it's accessible to everybody. So with that, we were going to discuss it a little more to really, really make it accessible and let us try to understand how you should approach this report. And so with us, we have a very eminent panel that I'm really honored to be moderating today. We have Dr. Sarah Cooper, who is the Director of the Climate Science Ocean Conservancy in Washington, D.C. She's an author of the 6th Assessment Report, and I was told you're also an IPBES author, but you said no. So yeah, she's an authority of this report, so we're really, really grateful that you had time to sit with us and reflect on this report. The next is Professor Hans Otto Pottner, the chair of the IPCC Working Group 2, and you have contributed to the IPCC report on land, cryosphere, and the 5th assessment report in various capacities. You're very welcome to this panel. And then finally, on the screen you see we're supposed to have Manuel Paulga Vidal, our lead of the climate and energy practice, and also the IUCN lead on the Climate Crisis Commission. And unfortunately, Manuel is caught up with another event. He'll join us later. So before us, we have Cornelius, an able deputy of Manuel, but also Cornelius is the WWF lead on the IPCC assessment report. But also Cornelius is one of the authors of this report that we are going to be discussing today. Now the flow of the event is that I'm going to give you a summary, the key messages in this report, and after that we'll have a conversation. The conversation is going to include all of us. The panel will start, you participate, and we've organized the conversation in 2 stages. First, just to reflect on this report that we published. How do we see it? What's the value of it? We know we put it together because we think we need to make it accessible, but let's really reflect on that together. And then the second session will be focusing on what it means, the so what. Now that we have this report, how do we want to see it? What do we want it to achieve for us as a global community? Okay? Thank you. Welcome, Manuel. Welcome. And you found us just in time, but yeah, as we agreed, you will participate in the event. Manuel has joined us, our global climate and energy lead of the WWF. You're most welcome. So very briefly, let me take you through the key messages in this report. The report is emphasizing that nature is an ally for us. It's an ally for mitigation and is an ally for adaptation in this crisis that we have. The report shows really what the IPCC shows, that global warming, nature can slow global warming, and it can offer protection to some of the impacts of climate change. Nature has already absorbed most of the impacts of the climate crisis. The IPCC report indicates 54% of the human-related carbon dioxide emissions over the past 10 years have already been absorbed by nature. This has saved us as humanity from much more severe impacts of the climate change. 31% is removed by the terrestrial ecosystems, including plants, animals, and soils. 23% is taken up by the ocean. But however, despite this important contribution that nature does for us, cleaning up the carbon dioxide that we are emitting, we are losing this ally. It's already too stretched. Some of the natural systems are being pushed beyond the limits, and some of the nature losses we have and we continue to see are permanently getting lost. This is true if global warming overshoots beyond 1.5. So already the 1.1, as indicated in the report, we are losing species already. We are losing nature already. But it is going to get worse when we go beyond 1.5. That is what is indicated in the report. And several decades, if we lose this over the next several decades, we will not be able to return to the levels that we need, even if we do our best. Now, if we are to continue to adapt to the slow climate change, we must safeguard nature, because it's really an ally and it's losing its ability to support us. We really have to work hard. So the IPCC report indicates that we need to conserve at least 30 to 50% of our land, of our fresh water, of our oceans, and so that we are able to safeguard ourselves. Not just nature, but ourselves also. So nature is an important ally. That's what the key message of the report. And it cannot do it on its own. We need to help nature to protect so that it continues to safeguard us. So we need to invest in nature alone, but investing in nature is not the only thing. We need to invest in the economy, because the reason why nature is being stretched is because of these pressures that come from the economy, that come from elsewhere. So those are the key messages in the report. So I'll turn to our panel today to reflect on this. What we've mentioned, is it really secret? Why do we need to emphasize this now? I would like to start with Dr. Cooper. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that great introduction. I think My area of the report really focused on ocean ecosystems, ocean and coastal systems. And, you know, I think what came to me as we worked on this was that the story of nature in the ocean is really forefront in people's minds, but that means they think that nature-based solutions are the only solutions, and that will be enough. And so it really struck me that most people can actually name nature-based adaptations off the top of their heads, you know, conservation, you know, area-based protections. But the close links between biodiversity and climate action and how tightly linked they are for the maintenance of biodiversity and actually preparing humanity and ecosystems to withstand the changes of climate, those linkages are not clear. And so I think the evidence really shows clearly that we've spent years and countless resources expanding nature-based solutions for the ocean, but it's still not enough because people don't realize that that's not enough. You know, we know the evidence really shows us that if we don't take additional swift climate-focused action to cut emissions, nature will be less of a help to us. The nature-based solution set kind of becomes less broad, and that is the secret that we found in the ocean and ecosystems work. It's imperative that decision makers need to know about this. And so we have a lot of storytelling that we need to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, as we move to Professor, as Sarah said, this is a 6th assessment report. We had a 5th assessment report that indicated a number of these things. Why aren't they listening? How do we need to make this, how do we need to present this in a way that really results in action? Because as you indicate in the report, we're already losing. You know, you're emphasizing this, that we are losing this. We are stretching it. We cannot take it for granted. How should we communicate this in a way that we invoke action that we need?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Barbara, and thanks a lot for having me in this discussion, and certainly based on the activities that we've had in this assessment cycle in our working groups. Such derivative products as you've done are much welcome, because that is what we need. We have a very careful process of putting the scientific information together and preparing a summary for policymakers that is approved word by word, line by line, and scrutinized for content, for reliability and confidence. And we certainly do our part in the outreach and bringing the messages to the public. And in this assessment cycle, I think IPCC has been extremely successful in bringing the messages out, because there is a lot of interest. Climate change is there and affecting all of us. But at the same time, we need being transferred into readable and understandable by the normal mortal, if I may say so. And this is what such products do. And so very much welcome, because there's one thing that is important to recognize, that the social mobilization that we were able to trigger after the special report on 1.5 degrees has been instrumental in raising, first of all, societal interest, especially of the young generation who were recognizing their future is at stake. The planet is losing livability due to climate change, but this kind of activism and mobilization we cannot do. IPCC is there to communicate the science to the policymakers. They are our stakeholders, and we are doing this in another formalized process where we communicate with the UNFCCC, which is kind of, it has been set up to be our stakeholders and discuss how these findings can be considered and can be implemented. So these products like yours are core to the communication process. They need to be more, and they need to be specifically designed for different audiences. And I think the more we can generate interest like this, the better. And these products are not approved, so we are hopeful and we know you as an organization, and we are hopeful that you present the information in the best possible way. And I've seen it, I've screened the product, and I've seen you're pairing it with illustrative examples, which is also instrumental in being successful, and it goes beyond what we can do. But this kind of communication, let me add this, is not enough. You're talking about the inertia, and it's that implementation is lagging behind, and that is an observation we are also making. We are not really, in our scientific assessments, we are not really addressing that inertia. It's something that we need to understand in order to find the best possible levels to break it. And one of the levels, and we are calling for that actually as part of our outreach activities, is improved education at all levels, broad education, in order to reach a tipping point in society that is really telling policymakers they don't have any other alternative but moving towards this. If they cannot follow the facts, they should be following the public pressure that is generated based on this communication.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. I really like your comment. I pick a number of things. One, you're saying all of us have a role to play. You're specialists, you put the data there, the information is there. But two, you worked with politicians, policymakers, not politicians, just policymakers. They need to take this forward. They may be doing it the best way they can, but we all have a role to play. So WWF has done its part of that role to really get the communications out, at least with relation to nature. So, Cornelius, is this enough? You are part of the key editors of this report, and actually part of the people behind getting this out. Clearly, its key messages for diverse audiences. But is it enough? We will reach the policymakers the way we want? Or is something more that we can do? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. So it's not enough. We did this report, and thank you for your kind words, Hans, because the IPCC reports are, for the general public, very difficult to read. They're thousands of pages long, and they're just not accessible for the general public. And so, how can we tell a story based on the science that's been assessed? And there's lots of stories in the IPCC. There's stories on energy, on development, and we've chosen to tell a story around nature. And we want to, I guess, tell a story so that the public can understand that nature is an ally. And is it secret? Barbara, you asked that earlier. I think it's we framed it as secret. Maybe it's more that it's underappreciated rather than secret. So I think we all know that nature is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. And so is it enough? No. We know the idea of protecting, conserving, restoring nature is not going to be enough. We know that because most of the emissions are from a sort of fossil fuel sector, we need to cut emissions, as Sarah said earlier. So there's those parts, but then how do we use something like this to get policymakers to do more? Because we've been telling them they need to cut emissions. We've been telling them they need to protect nature for other reasons. But I guess climate change is just an additional reason why you might want to do nature protection, do nature restoration. But it's certainly not the only reason.
Okay, great. It's really not a secret ally. It's just not being appreciated. To the three of you, before we move to Manuel, I want to ask, I know, Sarah, you mentioned a bit of that, but what struck you most in this time around? You've been part of the assessments. I think the three of you, before, what struck you most in this time around? It's more information, but a number of things may have stuck you, each one of you, that really gets you. Maybe it was actually also very fulfilling to say, we need to get this out across. Can we start with Sarah?
Sure. I think that it surprised me that, or it struck me that I always wind up referring to the joint IPCC IPBES report that came out talking about those very strong links between biodiversity conservation and our ability to take decisive and concerted and successful climate action. And I feel like that is a piece that almost no one knows about. And it just struck me again and again and again as we finalized the IPCC report, how underappreciated that message is, but how deserving of elevation that message is. And so we tried to really underscore that as we finalized this new report, to kind of really highlight that emerging finding that was connecting the two bodies of work.
Oh, fantastic. I'm an IPBES author, and this is very crucial because we emphasize the human aspects of taking decision. We had to get to the hearts and minds of people through diverse ways of knowing. So this is really, really important. Prof, for you, what struck you?
Well, certainly the inclusion of the results of this workshop report, I think, largely improved our Working Group 2 report in its summarizing phase,
Yeah.
and in its final stages. And a workshop and its report is instrumental to be included and considered by the following assessment reports of either IPCC and IPBES, and I'm sure IPBES will also do this in their current activities. For me, it was certainly an eye-opening experience to see how closely intertwined biodiversity and climate are, how closely interdependent the actions are that you can do with respect to biodiversity conservation and climate stabilization. So if you come from the side of climate and just focus on the means that you have for mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity will be suffering.
Yep.
If you don't consider the specific possibilities, capacities, and needs of biodiversity. And if you come from the biodiversity side, there is very little that you can do harm to the measures with respect to climate. That is very, very clear. And so it's about the maximum exploitation of what nature can do to contribute to climate stabilization. And I'm emphasizing this word, climate stabilization, rather than mitigation or adaptation, because what nature can do is a long-term thing. Nature does not provide the short-term fixes that currently people look for as an escape route, because they have the feeling they are not sufficiently successful on emissions reduction, which is true, and they are not sufficiently successful on adaptation, which is also true. And but looking for these escapes is not a good thing if you cannot really judge what this alternative technology can actually do. So there is discussion currently about carbon dioxide removal by natural ecosystems. And for those, you need to restore ecosystems, and you need to mobilize, make them resilient against climate change. You need to improve biodiversity and thereby maximize the capacity. But this takes time. And in terms of the rates that this process can provide, the rates are much lower than the current emission rates. So they will be very important over a long time once we have been successful cutting emissions down and bringing them by technological means or from our different sectors down close to net zero, and then the capacity of nature to absorb CO2 over time will play out to stabilize the climate.
Yeah.
So it's very critical that we are not losing this capacity, but we should not consider this as quick fixes, which some policymakers have already done, and they have beautified their emission numbers by saying, oh, if there's something we cannot really do, we put it into natural ecosystems.
Yes.
So I think this is also what our report has been telling us and has been bringing out to the public. And biodiversity, I think, is increasingly being recognized by the policy arena, because this is the first biodiversity day at the COP. Today is Biodiversity Day, is Ocean Action Day, and I don't know what other day there may be, but that is certainly, and the opening saw a high-level political interest this morning, and they were probably based on the workshop results and also how it was considered in the IPCC reports, emphasizing the interlinkages between biodiversity and climate change. So it was a big splash and a progress. Otherwise, our working group report has been somewhat sobering. Our risk assessments have shown we have been too conservative in those in the last assessment cycle. We have at the same time widened our risk assessments across systems and sectors, different ecosystems on land, different ecosystems in the ocean, but also human sectors, including human morbidity and mortality, because, you know, we work according to those principles, the same principles as the vulnerable organisms out there in the wild. And all of these risk assessments compiled are such a strong confirmation for the ambitious side of the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
And this news, this emphasis is coming at the same time where we're becoming increasingly skeptical about whether 1.5 degrees global warming can actually be held as a limit.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, so it should be a stimulation to tighten ambition, to increase ambition for mitigation and adaptation, both at the same time, in order to secure a livable future.
That is really comprehensive. A key message I've picked out of there is that this is a long-term, I mean, no quick fixes, and we cannot take biodiversity for granted. We have not, you've done very well to really amplify the value of biodiversity, this long-term perspective that we need to have. It has always been there, but we cannot take it for granted. Someone told me that often we focus on the events, the flood, the fire, and forget that actually the reason that event happens, creates the risk, is because the foundation has been eroded. The foundation often is the challenge that we often do not see because we focus on the event. Thank you so much. And as you can hear, this is such a rich report, the IPCC report. What this does is to really amplify the nature aspects that we need to get deep into and really look at, use this report to really then get into the details of the report that is there. Cornelius, quick one, because we have to manage a bit of the time, and I really want to get to Manuel just to say something about this report, and then we move to the next segment. Cornelius.
Yeah, it would be good to hear from Manuel and the links to CBD particularly. So, I mean, in terms of what struck me, I think there was a couple of things. So, I've worked in climate change, I mean, not as long as Hans, but for a decent amount of time, but I didn't realize how much the nature did for us. So I didn't realize it basically gives us a 50% discount on global warming. I didn't know that. And so that's something that really struck me. There's also, we pulled out one of the examples from the IPCC as one of our case studies, which was on a little sort of rat called the bramble K. melomus, which went extinct. So it's north of Australia, south of Papua New Guinea in the Torres Strait, an island that is small, and sea level rise, storm surges basically wiped out the habitation of this mammal. And it's not going to be it was the first to go extinct, but there will be others. And, there's been 12 people that have walked on the moon, and you can name 2 of them probably. So you'll be able to name this bramble caiman lotus, but you won't be able to name the 10th one or the 20th one. And so, it's sort of just the fact that, that it has highlighted that, climate change has already driven extinction. And, we need to, I think, as a conservation organization, WWF, but as, broader, that we need to recognize that, acting on climate change is so important for people and for nature.
Thank you. So I'll turn to Manuel. Manuel, we are reflecting on this report.
No, thank you, and sorry that I got here late and that I have now to run into some other. Sorry for that. I'm so ashamed. But let me say a couple of things, because this is the kind of report that immediately bring to you many things to be thought. So let me start by congratulating Steve, Shirley in the back, the chief editors of this fantastic report. So let me start with 3 or 4 reflections. My first one, it is nature as a secret ally. How much nature it has been a secret ally, or how much we used to be blind. And we used not to recognize the role that always nature was playing to address our challenges. So that is my first question. So it has been a secret, or it has been our own fault of never recognize that role. And I am all the time wondering why. Why we historically we have misvaluing the role of nature. And even until now we are not recognizing the strong role that nature could play. I am wondering, it is because we have not been able to strengthen the link in between nature and the economy, something that climate, it has historically been more able to develop, something that probably we have to evaluate how can we develop that narrative, how much nature loss it is connecting to our economies and to our own development. It could be that. It could be even a lack of awareness. Today I saw the Globe Scan survey, and the explanation of many people on why we are losing nature, it has been because of lack of awareness. So I am wondering, so we are failing as organizations. So we are regularly releasing reports, we are regularly raising information, but we have not been able to create that awareness. So something it has been to be fixed in that sense. So those are my first kind of reflection. The second one are more related to history. When I read this report, I was wondering, okay, so if nature it is our strong ally to address climate, why we fragmented in 92? Why we did 2 conventions that fragmented? And probably, yeah, that is a political reason. Probably that was the context at that time. And it is not that I am blaming that 92 process. Sometimes you have to fragment to then reunite. It is a really, the political decision, the policy-making process, it is something very interesting when you see how much sometimes you have to do this to split and then to reunite. So 30 years after Rio, we are reuniting things that we used to develop in a very fragmented way. And we have to take advantage of that new trend, because it is true, this is the first ever Biodiversity Day in a COP. And that is fantastic. And many good announcements has been promoted. And not only this has been the first ever Biodiversity Day in a COP, but also we have had 2, not we, but negotiators, parties, they have had 2 important meetings to discuss in this COP how much they could give an impulse to COP15. Fantastic, because that is happening by now. But also by self-reflection, it's amazing the role that science can play. I have been followed this process since the beginning. I went to Rio 92 when I was a kid, no, when I was 30, now I am 60. And I remember that the world took decision based on science. IPCC was created in 87, 88, no? One of those 2 years. And based on that information, at that time, the world adopted the Climate Change Convention. But then we entered into a process in which policymakers used to be more diverse to science. No? They were not listening. So we had a good impulse in 92, then the Kyoto Protocol, and then there were kind of decline because decision makers used not to listen to much science. But fortunately, and probably since the 5th synthesis report, that has changed, fortunately. But also because of the effort of science, of providing more understandable information. It is strongly based on science, but also with this policy-making synthesis report for policymakers, I think it is a title. Now it is easier to be read. It is more accessible. And also in this 6, I think it has been in the 6, there are 2 pages with some regional potential scenarios. It is modeling what it could happen in Latin America, in Africa, in different regions. So the role of science, it is something that fortunately it has been strengthened. Just remind, it was in COP in Katowice that the parties didn't want to welcome the IPCC report. You remember that? 3 COPs ago. And fortunately, the COP organized by Chile recovered the importance of science. And then Glasgow, for sure. And also IPCC, it is putting in the same level science with traditional knowledge. I love that. That recognition, it is showing the level of inclusiveness of the scientists, of the IPCC that are considering how much they could work together. And that for me, it is really important. So those are my 3 reflections to don't take too much time. So I really congratulate this report, but let me finish by saying something. It is true, nature is not going to bring to us the short-term way to fix things. Nature, it is more a long-term ally. But in the short term, we have to see how can we sort some contentious relation, because the relation in between climate and nature, it is an ally relation. But there are some contentious relations, because we don't know exactly what it would be that good balance in between emission reduction and removals. There are many organizations against offsets or the use of nature mechanism, because many organizations believe that that could mean a divest of the main objective of real and absolute emission reduction within the value chain and industry scope. What it is true. So we have to work on that. We have to define well, based on science, what is that good balance in between emissions and removal. That is a key element to keep credibility in the process and to continue having nature as a good ally. Sorry that I have taken too much time, and congratulations for the report.
Yes, thank you so much, Manuel. And this is really, really good food for thought. And really, thank you for getting to the next component, because that will be part of our discussion later. I don't know whether our panel wants to comment on really pose the number of really, really good food for thought or questions that we need to take into account. But I really, unless you do want, I really wanted to turn to the audience, at least just 2 comments from the audience to participate in this discussion. How do you see this report? And most importantly, because the report is about getting the information accessible. Is it enough? How much more do we need? Because as we said, we're just starting, you know? Yeah? Do you have anything to add, Sarah? Or do we go to the audience? 2 comments to the audience, if we have. Yes? Can you take around the microphone, please? So Manuel is saying, let's reflect. Let's reflect on the connection. Let's reflect on the history. Let's reflect on the long-term and short-term aspects. Yes, go ahead. You don't have to respond to Manuel, but how do you see this report? I mean, how do you see the value? How do you see this argument that nature is a secret ally? Is it really a secret ally, or we've just not paid attention
Sorry, I would
to
have
nature?
a question, but then
Okay.
can I?
The question we'll ask later, but yeah, you can go
No.
ahead, since you have the microphone.
Okay, thank you. Because in your introduction, that was great, and I never understood something, and from that point, and maybe it's very good to answer related to all of you what you said, because you we know, and it's also in the IPCC report and your report, how much nature in the ocean and land is taking up the carbon, and over the past 10 years, and also in the projection, it continues. But to me, it is just so confusing, because we also know that we are taking away land from the nature, we are actually destroying nature, so there is less and less biomass around. By today there is, so then what is taking up net our CO2, and how do we expect it to steep in the baseline scenarios to still taking up carbon dioxide, when actually we are actually destroying nature? And one would think that nature was in imbalance, then you wouldn't, then I would have thought that that's net zero. But I guess it's working group 3 question.
It's really fantastic, because that's a contradiction we are saying. That whereas it is absorbing, we've seen its value, we've underestimated value, we are losing. So what is wrong with us, people? Yes, Prof.
Maybe as a direct reply to that question, much of the uptake that we currently see is tied to the increase in atmospheric CO2 and is driven by the increase in atmospheric CO2. It would be much less if that CO2 would stop increasing, and that is what we need to be going for. So that is why we need to think about strengthening the natural mechanisms of CO2 binding and transport, so that it can be stored in the reservoirs, which are usually, and in the end, actually, in a wide range of areas, it's the sediment, the soils, the marine sediments, and it's the sediment, for example, that is accumulating in areas where mangroves are growing, which are the most carbon-rich ecosystems on the planet. So these kind of net export mechanisms do not come for granted. The capacity of CO2 binding by plant photosynthesis is temperature dependent, and there is a temperature dependent performance curve, and if temperature goes beyond that optimum, that rate capacity falls. And for many of the forests on the planet, we are seeing that this capacity is falling with every bit of warming, continuing to fall, especially during the hot seasons of the year. There is then very little happening, and then if these ecosystems are overused by deforestation, like we see currently in the Amazon, then on top of that we see a source turning into a sink turning into a source, even during periods when the atmospheric CO2 is still creeping up. So the physiology of these organisms is essentially what needs to be considered in terms of their role with respect to carbon storage. Yes, and one have actually reached a situation where our technological means of reducing CO2 emissions are leading to a stabilization of atmospheric CO2 levels. Then we need those natural carbon transport and export mechanisms to store away the excess CO2 and help long-term climate stabilization. So that is a picture that has been evolving for me over the last few years.
Sarah, you want to say something?
Sure, I'll just kind of offer an overarching comment. So in this report, the definition of nature is expansive. It's biodiversity, it's the natural processes that Hans was talking about. So yes, as human activity destroys biodiversity, some of the carbon uptake that Hans was talking about is reliant on inorganic processes, geological processes, physical processes, and there's a lot humans can do to disrupt those also. So this report really provides a broad picture of all of nature, and recognizing that we are jeopardizing some of the physical relationships, we are jeopardizing biological relationships. Thanks.
And as a social scientist, I would say we are also jeopardizing our own livelihoods. Any more comments or questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. Yonat Rinayo from WWF Uganda. Yeah, actually, to me, I'm really impressed with this kind of report that can even help us or help the nations in setting the NDC targets. Because when you look at the figures that were shown, it's like only 44% is being captured, being absorbed,
Can we show the
meaning
figures
we are accumulating over 50%. So how can we maybe use this report in our NDC targets or ambitions? So really, this is quite impressive, and I'm really excited with this. If we can follow the trend and keep tracking on how much maybe we are reducing, or we have a number of studies after quite some time to track the progress, I think this would be good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, can we have the last comment and then we go back to the panel to move to the next segment? Yes.
Hi. Koen Stuyck from Belgium. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I have just one question. The percentage of the 54%, that is based on the last 10 years, I understood. So are there any projections on how this would evolve when nature goes down? I mean, is it going to be 40% in 10 years, or are there any scenarios on this? Thank you.
Prof. Cornelius, who takes this one?
Well, it's always challenging to come up with numbers. Well, this is a bit... Yes. Thank you. I mean, what we know is that the physical capacity of the ocean to take up CO2 is declining with increased kind of CO2 saturation and acidification. So there's less and less taken up there. And at the same time, we see the capacity of CO2 uptake through photosynthesis into plant material declining. And I'm not so much aware of what the kind of temperature dependence is for soil CO2 uptake, but if it's tied to organisms, it probably also has a temperature dependent optimum. So there will be less and less of a lower and lower fraction of CO2 being taken up by these natural processes, and the velocity of CO2 increase in the atmosphere will be increased. And then we must be aware, I mean, these percent fractions that are given to us, they should not be mistaken as values that will still be in operation once we have cut back on our emissions. Because as I said, they are driven by the increase in atmospheric CO2. So the processes will become slower, and we need to strengthen the capacity of living organisms, essentially, to provide the natural transport chains. So if you think of phytoplankton growth in the ocean, we need to build back the stocks of those organisms that are contributing to this carbon export that goes beyond phytoplankton, zooplankton. It means building back fish stocks, and it means building back whale stocks that are actually redistributing the nutrients in the ocean and improve fertilization, enhance fertilization processes, and thereby CO2 binding. And we need to rebuild and restore those ecosystems that actually provide this continuous growth in carbon in sediments like the mangroves do. And this is so, in combination, we need to look at, and certainly we need to protect those systems that we still have, like the natural peatlands and the tropical forests that have stored away huge amounts of carbon so far.
Thank you. Yes, Cornelius, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I mean, we've got the last 10 years on here just because it was a nice number from the IPCC underlying report. But broadly, for the last few decades, it's broadly been constant. And I think, I mean, to Hans's point, what it does in the future depends on what we do, what our choices are now. So, you know, on a high emission scenario, it will be different to a lower emission scenario. And so, you know, if we put more and more into the atmosphere, then they are, you know, the systems are more likely to saturate and maybe not be able to help us as much in the future. So that's another reason why we need to do the emissions cuts as well as the protecting and restoring nature. Point on NDCs, you know, so how we use this, or how, you know, organizations sort of try and convince governments to improve their NDCs, because, you know, we want, under the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions to get tighter and tighter as time goes on. And that can be from emissions-wide, so economy-wide emissions reductions, which will include all of your economy. For some countries, it may be that they need to recognize the bigger parts of their economy, which may be in agriculture or maybe in the forest sector or something. So maybe relating to the natural world. And so something like this will hopefully be used by you know, WWF officers and others to, you know, say to the governments, look, you know, this is another reason why you need to step up and improve your targets, and then obviously do the implementation of them.
Yes, thank you. Cornelius, hold that mic, because already we are moving into the discussion of the so what. So what that we have this information. How do we use it moving forward? You know, we know the report is indicating we're already at 1.1, we are losing species. We're on a trajectory of moving forward. What do we do? And in the report, I would like to quote some figures that you've included that struck me a lot and really trigger action, really imply action. And I'll say something after I've read them. So I think in page 17 you mentioned, the report mentions that, I think it's the IPCC report also, that really mentions that we have less than 15% of land that is protected. Yeah, which is really speaks to implication of action. We have less than 21% of fresh water that is protected. We have less than 8% of oceans that are protected. Now, like I said, I'm from the other side of the social scientists. And when we hear protected, normally the quick assumption is that, oh my God, we're going to protect again. Whereas there's a problem. Clearly, we have to conserve nature. We have to look at nature to really save us. But there's also a worry that, you know, you're going to close off. This is what could be captured. So I want you to explain what this protection, what is implied, the form of protection that we are emphasizing here. Please clarify to the audience. Cornelius, I start with you, and then maybe Sarah?
Got the mic? Is it working? Yes, I'll have a go. So yeah, so the IPCC report talks about says 30 to 50% needs to be conserved, but then it has the words effective and equitable. So it's not just, as you say, putting a fence around it and stopping people going in. It needs to be, you know, so there's other forms, I think, of protection. So it can be, you know, under the stewardship of indigenous peoples and local communities and those sorts of things. And I think there needs to be, you know, any effort to protect needs to have, you know, the free, prior and informed consent of the people that are there. But, you know, the numbers you read out, you know, they're small compared to the size of the challenge. You know, if the science says we need 30 to 50%, and at the moment we've got the idea that we want 30 by 30, so that's a milestone to an increased number over time. But it's clear from, you know, the report we've written and the underlying IPCC report that that is what is needed if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and, you know, obviously with the cutting emissions, or else we'll see worse and worse impacts of climate change on and affecting people and nature.
Thank you. Sarah, what forms of protections did you study? Did you analyze? Yep. Which implies what forms of protection do we need?
Well, you know, just building on what was said before, we have a number of different types of conservation measures. And so a lot of the, you know, the very small numbers that are listed for the oceans don't always reflect areas that are under indigenous supervision or under other sorts of effective conservation measures. And so, I think one thing that I see happens a lot in the conservation conversation around oceans is, which type of conservation? Like, do we need to have fully and highly protected? Do we need to have, there's several gradations. We won't go into them now. But there's kind of a battle over whose type of conservation is the best. But I think we need to be moving to a place where we're looking at an entire spectrum of conservation measures. Some places will need to have more comprehensive measures, and others will be more use-based conservation measures. All of those measures are effective when implemented in a thoughtful way that includes, that takes into account context and use and future prospects for that place. And so I think that's an important piece that I would like to see grow in the conversation about, absolute percents.
Yeah. That's really a good question, Prof. As you come in, I think I really like what you say, that is context, is everybody. This report is written for everybody. So in addition to governments, but as well as civil society, communities, how do we use this report to protect? And how do we define it is up to us. Yeah? Prof?
Yeah, thank you. I think these are important points. And if I go back to the wording that we used in the IPCC IPBES joint report, we were talking about area that is effectively protected, and this sort of meaning behind that is that how much protection do we need for nature to actually carry out what it needs to be doing, to be functional, to be healthy, and this does not exclude sustainable uses. And then we were developing a landscape approach to how this could play out, and we called it a mosaic approach, where we say we need effectively protected areas neighbored, which also include species migration corridors, as climate change is mobilizing species and changing their geographical distribution, paired with places which are sustainably used, paired with then the intensively used spaces, which are the cities, the agricultural areas, and so forth, so that we get a mosaic landscape for land as well as a mosaic seascape for the ocean. So because of the different intensity of uses, and at the same time respecting what nature needs to do to be functional. Now the surface area, sort of the 30 to 50% number, is an orientation. This needs to be ecosystem specific, and for many ecosystems, actually, I think we still need to figure out how much protection is needed. And if we look at a large system like the Amazon that is generating its own climate, we need to protect 80% of the surface area of the Amazon to keep it in the way that it is. Otherwise, it will be tipping into becoming a dry forest. And this is sort of a tipping point that we are approaching with increasing and continuing deforestation. So we need to be aware of what nature needs. We need to be aware of what humans need, and we need to find a compromise and a strategy that allows both sides to thrive.
Thank you so much. Can we get from the audience participate in the discussion? So what? We have this report. It really emphasizes the connection between nature and climate. How do we use it? Jonas, you mentioned using it for NDC, informing NDCs. Any other ideas on how we should use this report? I know we have 1 minute. We have 1 minute to conclude. Yes, Sarah, go ahead.
So after I presented some IPCC results, an enthusiastic young person came up and said, "Is this the right way to communicate to policymakers?" And I said, "Absolutely not," because it was way too complicated. But a report like this one has case studies. It has place-based stories. And as I explained to this young person, These are the kinds of things that get the attention of decision makers. When you have their attention, then you can back in and talk about what science is relevant to that particular case study and what future projections you might have from it. And he was grateful for the information, and I felt, wow, we've saved the day here by kind of not inflicting these highly complex things on decision makers as a first, hi, how are you? Let me tell you about science moment. So these reports are important to ease people in and show them the context.
No, thank you. So in the last minute, I would really want to thank you all. I want to really thank the panel for really trying to digest this complex work that we need, the science that we need, and we have to be able to communicate and use it, especially with policymakers, and for me, not just policymakers, everyday people. How do we use this information, this power that we use then to influence and cause action? So with that, I would like to give each of my panelists one last word, and then we wrap up. Can we start with Cornelius? Key message.
I don't like being put on the spot right at the end. Yeah, so I think the key messages are, nature, maybe it's not a secret ally, but nature is our ally. It's, our ally on mitigation, so it helps slow global warming. It's our ally on resistance and resilience, and adaptation. So, it protects us from worst impacts, and we need to protect it. That's the only way we're going to keep it as an ally.
Indeed, and as we are currently seeing inertia in the system, and we need to find the right levels for taking action and accelerating action, I think this will be our key task, and we need to mobilize the energy in many different places, and by information, by changing the education system, making the life-sustaining functioning of the planet a core element in schools, in universities, so that everybody is aware, and this is taken into families, and where the young generation mobilizes the parents, and also taken into careers like those of policymakers, who should just not only study political sciences in order to then be the decision makers that are dealing with these issues.
Thank you, Sarah. You have so much to say.
It's the end of a long day, and I'm really thinking about what my colleagues have said. I really just want to share that nature and healthy natural systems are absolutely the bedrock on which other climate actions and climate preparedness can happen. And I think it's easy to take it for granted, and that's the thing we need to stop doing, because it's the foundation that we walk on to take climate action. So, thanks.
Thank you. I really like this report. I know it's my colleagues, Cornelius and Shelley, who really were the main brains and energy behind it. But it's really simple to approach. I work with movements. I work with local people. And I think I can use this information to mobilize action, mobilize policymakers. It's really accessible for everyone. It has numbers for communicators. It has information that we can use for policy engagement. So thank you so much. Please read the report, use it with your constituents, and actually use it to access the larger report. Okay? So thank you so much, and yeah, well done, team.